I think one of the really interesting things about caribou, it's also probably part of their downfall, is they're not very wary animals at all. We would be, up in the middle of nowhere in the Selkirks where caribou had been hanging out, be doing habitat plots and measuring vegetation and stuff, and you might look over and there'd be a cow and a calf standing there looking at you at 50 yards. They're curious, and they're fairly docile. They're not, their whole behavioral evolution, I guess, is to be where other critters are not. They don't do well in the face of predation, and that certainly has affected the outcome in the Selkirks. So their evolutionary behavior is such that they just go where other animals are not, and I think that's resulted in them being fairly unwary. When you put them in the face of predation, they don't do well because they're not elusive like a white-tailed deer. They're just not aware, and then they have a fairly high mortality rate when they're asked to be in the presence of a lot of other predators.
I guess the question then is, can we have caribou in the Selkirks if they are unable to go where others are not?
Yeah. Historically, there were certainly caribou in the Selkirks, no question about that. So at a point in time, the Selkirks were fully capable of supporting a viable population of caribou. I think what's happened, though, through time, and probably starting to a significant degree in the 1950s, was man-caused influences, logging, and it kind of confuses people because a lot of the logging then wasn't at high elevation areas where the caribou were. It was at low to mid elevation, and it's like, well, where's the conflict there? Well, things like white-tailed deer really like young seral forests. So by logging, it opened up the forest, created this young seral forest that white-tailed deer do really well in. And so that resulted in increased levels of white-tailed deer over what was historically present. And then, of course, along with that, it supports higher densities of predators. And in this case, we're talking about primarily mountain lions. At the time, wolves were not present. They had been extirpated. So there were black bears, there were mountain lions, and there were a few grizzly bears, but the numbers were way down on them as well. They'd been almost removed from the Selkirks. But anyway, in the 50s and then into the 60s and 70s, there were this man-caused influence, logging, but there was also some large wildfires. It kind of resulted in the same thing. It resulted in a young seral forest. It really helped other ungulates, whether it's white-tailed deer or elk. It also helped grizzly bears a lot. Some of the fires resulted in some really large-scale huckleberry patches, which is primary forage for grizzly bears in the Selkirks. So you went from, say, in historical perspective, pre-European settlement, a relatively pristine, if you will, area without a lot of young forest. It was a lot of fairly old growth, not necessarily old growth legal definition, but old forest that didn't support a lot of other animals, and that's why caribou did pretty well in there. As the system has changed, some of it man-caused, some of it natural, it's shifted the dynamics in there, and now there's higher densities of everything else, which is great from say a hunting standpoint. If you're a deer hunter or an elk hunter, things are better now than they ever were, or certainly in the 40s and 50s. But it didn't do well for caribou at all. Now we're asking caribou to exist in an area that's rich in other animals, including other alternate prey as well as predators, and they just don't do well in that situation. And then if you throw in climate change on top of that, because in the winter caribou are very dependent on the very deep snow in the Selkirks to get that lift up into the canopy in late winter in January, February. They eat lichen out of the subalpine fir at high elevation in the Selkirks, and that deep snow gives them the lift up into the canopy to access that lichen. Now, with climate change, if it's going to result in significantly lower snowpack, then that's going to affect the ability of caribou to exist during that season as well. Not a real rosy picture, I'm afraid.
Yeah. So, do you think it seems like you don't think there's space for caribou in the Selkirks anymore.
Yeah, and that's a little confusing too, because if you look at, say, if you just map how much is old forest in the Selkirks, whether it's old growth or just old forest, old subalpine fir that's capable of supporting lichen that will support caribou, there's actually enough acreage of that to support caribou, but the problem is the mortality that's associated with the other prey. So, you can fly over the Selkirks and say, man, there's a lot of pretty good looking caribou habitat out there, and there is. But unfortunately, it comes with an altered ecosystem that now has a different prey and predator base than was present. So I think under the current conditions, no, I don't think that the Selkirks can support a viable population of caribou. It might be able to support a few caribou, but as far as a self-reproducing, self-sustaining population, I don't think that that's capable, that the Selkirks are capable of supporting that anymore, unfortunately.
And that's due mainly to the proximity then of old growth caribou habitat to younger sterile forests that favor white-tailed deer and thus predators. Is it that these two spaces are too proximal, they're touching?
Yeah, I think one of the problems with the Selkirks, if you look at the shape of the ecosystem on the map, it's kind of a long, skinny thing with a couple of different lobes. And even the middle of the Selkirks is not very far from the edge of the Selkirks, which are the valley bottoms, which are great wintering areas for things like white-tailed deer. So it is a proximity issue, and a lot of it is the shape of the ecosystem. If it was a big fat round thing, there might be, a refuge in the middle, but because it's kind of a long, skinny ecosystem, the center is never very far from the edge, and that. With the movement, white-tailed deer are not great migrators, although we have had some fairly long movements of radio-collared white-tailed deer in the area. But the edges, which are the valley, are never very far from the top of the Selkirks, which is where the good caribou habitat mostly is.
So you said you arrived in Bonners Ferry after the second translocation, or it was the last translocation in Idaho.
Yeah.
At that point, do you think people had a sense that this was not space conducive to caribou?
I think at that time, it was, like I say, early in the process, we were really starting out with just learning some basic biology of caribou in the Selkirks. I think when I got there in 1990, there were still a lot of unanswered questions, and actually as we continued to learn about caribou through all the studies, the population actually was kind of barely climbing. I think we do winter surveys to get a pretty accurate, I think, census of the caribou in the Selkirks. Kind of a two-stage fixed-wing helicopter survey that was pretty intensive, and I think we did a good job of counting caribou. There was some population growth following the augmentation. Originally, and not unusual for an augmentation, you have a fairly high mortality period post-release. They're new animals in an unfamiliar habitat, and they move around, and some of them get killed. But once you get over that initial mortality, there was actually some growth, and it was slightly encouraging. I think we were up around 50 caribou for several years, which, you know, from a long-term viability, 50 caribou isn't going to cut it. I mean, you need more than that, but at least it was trending in the right direction, and it seemed to have plateaued. But then, and Washington did an augmentation in 96, 97, and 98, put some more caribou in the ecosystem. And they seemed to be stable for a while, but then things really started dropping off. And that coincided with the reestablishment of wolves in the Selkirks. And it's not that wolves are the sole culprit in this whole equation. It was kind of the cumulative effect of large-scale habitat changes and changes in alternate prey. They were already just holding their own with the presence of grizzly bears, black bears, and mountain lions were the primary predators. And then we added another predator in there in the form of wolves, and I think it was just the cumulative effect that then resulted where we are today. That as far as we know, there are no caribou in the ecosystem right now.